Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Sara Montague. It's more than 60 years since the Dalai Lama fled Tibet and set up a government in exile, hopeful of one day going back. Since then, China has banned any mention of the spiritual leader in his homeland, and there are reports of widespread human rights abuses. My guest today is the president of that self-declared government in exile, Penpa Tsering. Will he ever get to see his ancestral homeland, let alone govern it? Penpa Tsering, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you.
What is the dream? What is it that you want for Tibet?
Considering the reality of the situation and the common interests of people, now we are asking for autonomy rather than independence. A genuine autonomy, not only in name, but also in essence. That is what we are looking for. To resolve the Sino-Tibet conflict in a non-violent, peaceful means through negotiation that should be mutually beneficial and lasting.
Okay, so just to be clear, because China's foreign ministry spokesperson has said the so-called Tibetan government in exile is an out-and-out separatist political group. You are saying that you are no longer that. You accept that Tibet is part of China.
Whether it's part of China, of course, in future, if the Tibetan issue is resolved, then we can be part of China. But historically, Tibet has been an independent country. So what we are asking for, considering the reality of the situation inside Tibet, whether the Tibetan identity will remain alive or not, that is the biggest question for us. So to preserve the Tibetan identity, Tibetan language, Tibetan culture, Tibetan religion, Tibetan way of life and protection of Tibet's environment, that is more important for us.
Okay, we're going to come on to that in a moment, but I just want to make clear about your goals, because there isn't a country in the world that disputes China's claim to sovereignty over Tibet. Do you still dispute that? Because that's one of the reasons they say there's no point having conversations.
No, China always, they used to put this precondition for His Holiness to say that Tibet has been part of China since antiquity or times immemorial. But that's not the case. That is not the truth. Tibet has been independent till Communist China invaded Tibet. So that is the reality. But then we leave the independent status of Tibet aside, but ask for genuine autonomy for the benefit of the Tibetans in the future.
Okay, and that autonomy, I mean, what does it look like? Does it look like Hong Kong?
Not necessarily, because the situations are completely different. Hong Kong people are Chinese people, Tibetan are Tibetan people. We are not Chinese people. So,
but does it look like Taiwan? They are Chinese people?
They are also Chinese people.
But they have more independence. I'm just wondering, this autonomy that you talk about, how on earth can it work?
No, when we say middle way, we are talking about avoiding extreme polarities. And the polarities in this case is the independent status of the historical independent status of Tibet on the one hand, and the present condition of Chinese occupation in Tibet on the other hand. So we have to find a middle way.
Indeed, but your middle way, which you always talk about, I'm trying to envisage how it could work. With you as a president of an autonomous region working alongside and with the Chinese government.
That is what His Holiness said. Autonomy means that we are willing to live within the constitution or the framework of the Chinese constitution.
Can you see that working?
Autonomy also means that we are willing to live within the framework of the Chinese constitution.
Okay, but can you see it working? It's all very well saying that.
Yes.
The reality.
No, these are something, this I cannot say for what the form of autonomy will shape up. But this is something that we need to discuss with China and then find out what is possible.
Okay, but it's just that here you are accepting something that clearly it's not really the dream. Your dream is an independent Tibet. You've accepted it perhaps because since 1959, when the Dalai Lama went into exile, that dream has only got further and further away. I mean, you accept that, do you?
Now, under the present circumstances, yes. But we believe in impermanence. Things have to change. In China also things will have to change.
But in the way that they have changed in the last 60 years, your dream has only got further away. Your efforts at realizing it have only, have failed.
Failed? I don't know. We're still here. If we have failed, we would be nowhere. I won't be speaking to you today.
Okay, well, let's talk about what you said is the paramount concern, preserving the identity of Tibet and Tibetans. There are some very big claims made about what is happening in Tibet. You said it's dying a slow death under Chinese rule. The US Republican representative Chris Smith talks of it as an ongoing genocide. You've just come from the United States. The actor, the Tibet activist Richard Gere, talks of what's going on as matching the definition of crimes against humanity. What are we talking about that you say is such a threat?
Politically, there is no space whatsoever for the Tibetans to express their feelings, let alone do other things, political activities. So all your political actions are linked to the welfare of your near and dear ones. So if I commit self-immolation today, I have to think many times. I may die, I might get scarred for life, but it's my kins and friends who are going to suffer because of that.
So just to be clear, if you set yourself on fire, one of the reasons not to do that is who would suffer after you have gone.
That is what the Chinese government does. All your actions are linked to the welfare of your near and dear ones. That is the gridlock system, where people don't have, so you have to think many times. As I mentioned, 157 Tibetans have self-immolated so far, hoping against hope that the Chinese government will pay some attention to their plight, or hoping against hope that the international community will come to their rescue. It's not happening.
We are in a strange situation, though, because you have never been to Tibet, have you?
That's why to fulfill my emotional needs, I try to go to the Indo-Tibetan border as much as possible to see Tibet from the other side.
But what do you know about what it's like there? Because you make claims about the claims that we're talking about. Do you know how the welfare of the people of Tibet is best served?
Here we have Tibetans coming out from Tibet. We have our network of information. So we study the situation inside Tibet. We know what's happening there.
Paint us a picture, if you will, about the kind of things that you're talking about, which are eradicating the identity of the Tibetans.
Just like every other culture, the Tibetan Buddhist culture is also based on Tibetan language. Now, today, the Chinese government policies and programs are all aimed at eradication of the Tibetan language. At one time, I really used to fear demographic aggression from China. Of course, there are more Chinese in Tibet than Tibetans, but now they have changed their tactic, and now they have started colonial-style boarding schools, where children from 3 to 6 years old, a few years back, was only several hundred in boarding schools.
Can I just pick you up on something you said there? There are more Chinese in Tibet than Tibetans. There are 3.5 million people in Tibet.
That also depends on how you define Tibet geographically.
Indeed, but in the autonomous region of Tibet, it's understood that there are 3.5 million people. How many of them are Tibetan and how many of them are Chinese, do you know, roughly?
Roughly, we still have problems in counting military and the temporary laborers who keep moving in and out. But otherwise, in the whole of Tibet, in the whole traditional Tibet, we are counting about 7 million Tibetans.
But that is around the world and in China. What I'm wondering is that in the Tibetan autonomous region, the area that we're talking about, you said that there are more Chinese than Tibetans, but there aren't, are there? Not according to the census.
Yeah, that census again, if you look at the Chinese census of 2020, how definitive it is in terms of defining residences or hukou system. So,
Yes, it's just that Professor Andrew Fisher, who's a Tibet expert at the Institute of Social Studies at The Hague, in The Hague, he looked at the census and he says the Han Chinese population, it is increasing, but from a very low base, and it still is a small minority in the country, in the nation.
That depends on how much you trust the Chinese numbers.
So you think there has been a deliberate policy of allowing Han Chinese people to move there?
That has been there. Now it is not as much as we feared. That's what I was pointing out. So if that is why they are changing the policy to start these boarding schools.
Right, so the boarding schools are what? Are for Tibetan children who get sent away?
Who are sent to boarding schools, and in these boarding schools, then you are taught Chinese. Even the medium of instruction is Mandarin. Then you are taught Chinese history, the Chinese historical version of communist China. Then you are taught how to maintain your allegiance to the Communist Party, all that. And Tibetan language is only 4 classes in a week, as they claim.
So China says, the official Xinhua news agency says, that actually what's happened in the region is that you have double-digit economic growth there over a quarter of a century, that poverty has reduced by 80%, that people live longer. It was 35 in the 1950s, and now it's people live till they're 70. And they cite these things as reasons that China has benefited Tibet.
If Tibet had been left alone by themselves or for themselves, we would have also achieved a certain level of development. I don't think it is necessary for China to come to Tibet to claim such developments. Of course, every time when there are talks in the Chinese upper echelons, they always say, oh, we developed Tibet so much. So why are the Tibetans complaining? But the problem with the Chinese leadership is they fail to understand the real aspiration of the Tibetan people. It's not just economic development. Because for China, any problem, solution is economic development, economic development. They don't think about people's mind and their aspirations.
Is it too late? And the reason I ask that is that when a Reuters journalist was taken there on a tour and admitted it was closely guarded and guided, he spoke to a monk at Lhasa's historic Jokhang temple, and when he was asked who his spiritual leader was, he said, President Xi, China's president.
You know the situation inside Tibet, so if you don't abide by the Chinese leader's words, then you'll end up in problem. And you can also see that Chinese leaders are communists, but they are forcing their pictures from Mao Zedong to Deng Xiaoping to Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao. Their pictures are forced to be displayed in the monasteries.
Indeed, there are no pictures of the Dalai Lama in monasteries. There are no pictures of the Dalai Lama anywhere.
Not allowed. In the Tibet Autonomous Region,
and hasn't been in so long. And what I wonder is whether you are fighting for something that can no longer exist because Tibet has moved on.
Cannot exist as a people or as a country?
The culture, whether you're too late. I mean, whatever the rights and wrongs of your claim, 60 years on, are you too late? Are you fighting for something that no longer exists?
Yeah, it's being eroded, it's being decimated. That does not necessarily mean to say that it no longer exists. Of course, every community moves on, every country moves on. And that is why in exile we have strived very hard over the last 63 years to re-establish most of the monastic institutions in exile in India, Nepal and Bhutan and elsewhere, also in other parts of the world.
You have said previously, you said a couple of years ago, that there were back channels with China that remained active, despite there being no official communications between the two. Are they still active? Do you speak to the Chinese?
There are, yes.
What purpose do they serve?
Oh, of course, if the Tibetan Sino-Tibet conflict needs to be resolved peacefully, then there's no other way than by talking with the Chinese leadership.
So have you spoken with the Chinese leadership?
As I said, back channels, yes.
Which presumably means you have?
Yes.
What do you ask for?
First, we have to build the contacts. We are not on the stage of negotiation. First, we have to rebuild the contact, and that is the stage. It's too early to talk about right now.
One of the things you mentioned that you did want to see was for the Dalai Lama to be allowed to go back to Tibet. Now, we're talking about somebody who's, in his late 80s. Is there any chance that you can see of that happening?
Let us see in the next months and years. We are really hoping that he will be able to go back to Tibet, but that does not necessarily mean to say that he will stay back in Tibet. So if he gets the opportunity to go to China and Tibet, he will go, but he will return back to India.
Okay, what's making you hopeful that he'll be able to go there, even on a short visit?
We always remain positive. We always remain hopeful. If it is not hope, then we would not be where we are today.
Right. I want to talk about the Dalai Lama now and what he's done, because Fan Chunwen, the Secretary for Tibet's Department of Education, said since Dalai defected, he hasn't done anything good for the Tibetan people. How do you reply to that?
That's what they always say, and you know we all know what His Holiness has been doing over the last 63 years. Inside Tibet, there's no way he can do anything other than inspire people, and it's because of him that Tibetans are desisting from any kind of violence. It's not because Tibetans cannot take up violence. His Holiness said, if you take up violence, I will no more be responsible for the Tibetan cause. So that itself is an influence of the Tibetan of His Holiness on the Tibetans, and improving situation inside Tibet is not in his hands, but in exile. Over the last 63 years, we managed to establish compact communities. In these compact communities, we started our schools, our monastic institutions, our cultural institutions, and so on. And that's how we survive today.
Well, let's talk about what happened in February when the Dalai Lama, at a public and a filmed event, kissed a young boy on the lips, and he said to him, "Suck my tongue." How do you explain that?
This was a little bit out of the way. I have not seen His Holiness in that sense in my 25 years of association.
You were surprised?
When the clip came out, I was surprised.
You were shocked?
Not shocked, because I know His Holiness' intent, because he is a Buddhist monk who has been practicing Buddhism over the last 87 years, and there is no instance or track record of His Holiness having done anything of that sort. So in that sense, I was not shocked. I was not even worried. But then, of course, people will have their opinion, and they have the right to their opinion, and particularly
it's not surprising, is it? I mean,
for me,
an 87-year-old man says to a young boy, 9 years old, "Suck my tongue." It's not surprising people are shocked.
So if you watch the whole video,
which I have,
yourself, then you will know whether this is a grandfatherly love or a lust.
Suck my tongue. It's in the words of the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, which is a US organization. They said an 87-year-old man asking a young boy to perform a blatantly sexual act in a public setting is very disturbing.
Suck my tongue. Maybe for Westerners it's a sexual thing, but in Tibetan, when we were younger, we used to be pulled, we used to be kissed, we used to be served food, when elders chew and then give food to the younger ones. That is all natural, but then this suck my tongue is more like eat my tongue. If you look at the whole video, it starts with, I'm not trying to blame the boy, it starts with His Holiness arriving and the boy breaking the coconut as an auspicious welcome for him. Then His Holiness sits down, and the boy was also given the responsibility to present a gift to His Holiness.
Indeed, and the boy later comes back and asks for a hug.
Yes.
But watching the whole sequence of it, one's still left thinking, that was very strange. He's 87?
87, going to be 88.
One of the things that has been talked about is the plan, if there is such a one, for his reincarnation. He has said he will appoint a Lama when he's 90. How is that going to work?
So the only official document that is available right now is the 2011 September document on His Holiness reincarnation. That says that when His Holiness reaches the age of 90, then he'll take certain decisions. So he's already 87, going to be 88 in another 2 years' time. We will go through certain procedures within the community, and then His Holiness, when he reaches 90, we will also be organizing a lot of meetings, including religious heads.
Indeed. The reason I ask this is that he has been just a pivotal figure among Tibetans in exile, campaigning around the world. He can't travel so much now.
Yes.
Whoever takes on that position could be very powerful, or they could be a young boy unable to be involved for, 20 years, or indeed a young girl, or an American, or is it possible that somebody who is a fair bit older could be anointed as Lama?
No, those options are still open. So His Holiness is, when he is asked whether it could be a woman, he says yes, it could be a woman. So
it could be an American who's in their 30s?
It could be anybody. It need not necessarily be a Tibetan. If His Holiness is reborn in India, then he'll be called Indian. If he's reborn in America, then he will be American.
And when China declares a Lama, as it's expected to do, what happens then?
So I don't know, because the question is, I keep chiding my Chinese friends, saying, let us see whether His Holiness the Dalai Lama outlives the Communist Party or the Communist Party outlives the Dalai Lama. So whenever that time comes, if China decides, I don't know whether these leaders will still be around or not, but whenever that time comes, if China decides to choose one and the Tibetans decides to choose one, I tell the Chinese government, do you want a lifelong problem on your hands? If you
Do you
have
think
two
you
Dalai
will
Lamas?
ever see Tibet? You were born outside the country.
I really look forward to it. I really think I will be able to go back.
Realistically, when?
When? Nobody knows. If I can tell that, then I would have clear words.
But there is a plan, 550. Is it 5 years? Is it 50 years?
I'm not into numbers. I'm more into practical things.
And the practical next steps for the government in exile are what?
And to reach out to the Chinese government and see how we can resolve this. And till such a time, reach out to the international community and explain the situation about Tibet.
Penpa Tsering, thank you very much for coming on Hard Talk.
Thank you so much.